June 19th, 1986 is easily one of the most tragic days in sports history and definitely the most tragic day in NBA history. It's the day that Len Bias, one of the future greats of the league, died barely 2 days after being drafted number 2 overall by the Boston Celtics. The immediate effect of his death was complete shock, as even after being interviewed by the Celtics, nobody pegged him as someone who would use drugs. But believe it or not, the effects of this tragedy are still being felt in today's league, and that's part of what I'm here to discuss today. What's up, NBA fans? Dom 2K on the mic, and I'm not here to rehash the Len Bias story because many of you already know it. For the purposes of this video, there's just a few main points I want you to know. Len Bias was an amazing small forward prospect that stood at 6'9", weighing around 210 pounds. Although he played small forward, he could do time at the power forward position as well, which was an asset Boston planned to use as he would be backing up both Kevin McHale and Larry Bird. Bias had the build of an android when he was still in college, and by his senior year, he was putting up averages of 23.2 points and 7 rebounds while shooting a cool 54% from the field. He was praised for being somewhat ahead of his time due to the type of game he could play at his size, which made him one of the most dynamic basketball players many had ever seen. George Raveling, who is a former college basketball coach, said, quote, "With an otherworldly flight game, immense physical stature, and his ability to create beautiful symphonies with his bizarre combination of strength, size, coordination, and skills, Len Bias' game embodied the direction the game was heading in. He was a sign on the basketball highway that said, exit 6, LeBron James, 1,000 miles. So now that you've got a rough idea of how Bias was supposed to shake up the basketball world, you understand the significance of him being drafted by a Boston team that was fresh off of an NBA championship in what Larry Bird has called the best team he ever played on. You're probably asking, how did a Celtics team this great wind up with the second pick in the draft in the first place? Well, pretty much the same way the Pistons ended up with the second pick in the same year they went on to win the championship. The Celtics acquired Seattle's first round pick through trade in 1984, and since Seattle ended up with such a poor record, that pick turned out to be the second pick. Sounds almost exactly like how Boston ended up with the first pick this year. Their logo ain't a leprechaun for nothing. Well, except that doesn't really apply to the Bias situation. And before we get into that situation fully, as always, I've got some merchandise for you guys. This time they're Len Bias shirts. Many of you already know who he is, so the links are in the comment section and in the description below, so you can go ahead and get those if you want them. And if you don't know who he is, you will after this video. So let's say this situation goes differently. What if Len Bias doesn't travel back to his college on the 19th to do cocaine with some friends? What if he lives on to play basketball for a Boston Celtics team that had just won the championship in dominant fashion? Well, we're gonna start in order. First, this is a loaded Celtics team that features Bird, McHale, and Parrish in the front line, while Hall of Famer Dennis Johnson and Danny Ainge are holding down the guard positions. Even with Bias' amazing talent, he doesn't crack that starting lineup just yet, but that's because Boston doesn't want him to. They imagined that he was the forward of the future, so bringing him along slowly was okay, and at this point it's actually the best option for a couple of reasons. Although Larry Bird is only 29 years old, the process of his back breaking down has already begun in the previous summer when he decided to do concrete work on his own. Combining this with the ridiculous strain he puts on his body each season will severely hinder him in the next few years. On top of that, Kevin McHale will go on to break his foot, and instead of sitting out the necessary time needed to heal, he opts to play on the foot to keep Boston's title hopes alive. These two things originally happened without having Bias to back them up, which was the plan, but with Len Bias playing major minutes at the 3 and the 4, Bird and McHale take significantly less pounding throughout the season. Bird doesn't have to do nearly as much for Boston's success, and if Kevin McHale still breaks his foot, now he gets to sit out and properly rest it while Bird and Bias pick up the load. By the time the 1987 NBA Finals happens against the Lakers, the Celtics aren't nearly as beat up as they were originally. When this final series originally happened, Boston took the Lakers 6 games despite having to play McHale 30 minutes a game on a broken foot and having to play Larry Bird 42 minutes a game this series. Both of these guys ranked in the top 15 for minutes played that season coming into the playoffs, so they had no maintenance time before this. Despite that, McHale was still able to give the Lakers 20 points and 9 rebounds on nearly 60% field goal shooting that series. So knowing everything we know about what did happen, and assuming Bias would have been an amazing pro, his addition to the team should be enough to propel the Celtics to a 1987 NBA championship over the Lakers, giving them a repeat and clinching their 4th title that decade. This also changes the Celtics-Lakers rivalry for a moment, as Boston now leads 2-1 instead of it being the other way around. Remember, we didn't even discuss the part about how well Bias and Bird would play together. You probably already know that Bird had one of the highest IQs and court vision ever, so pairing him with the athleticism of Bias would have given us some of the most amazing highlights ever. Not to mention having another superstar who could handle the ball on the floor with Bird just wouldn't have been fair at all. But the Celtics being able to employ the services of Bias don't just change the '87 finals, it quite literally extends the life of the Celtics-Lakers rivalry while creating another one in the process. Recall two things. One, the Celtics fell from dominance after the '87 finals. McHale was never the same player after playing on the injured foot, and Bird ended up having to lay in back braces just to participate in regular games. And two, the Lakers continued to compete for championships up until 1991, making the finals for 3 of the next 4 seasons. The addition of Bias acts as a lifeline for the Celtics, who can now depend on him more and more as the veterans need to rest, meaning their reign of dominance can extend well into the 90s. Remember, Bias was only 22 at the time of his death. Assuming he could play as a star for at least a decade and some change, Boston has plenty of opportunities to stay as dominant as they transition out of the Bird era. It's almost like how the Spurs were able to transition out of the Duncan era while still being dominant with the emergence of Kawhi Leonard. So immediately, there's an amazing chance that we see another 2 finals in '88 and '89 featuring the Celtics and Lakers. But let's move away from that for a second, because now we're reaching the butterfly effect territory. As the years pass, it's impossible to say what teams make what moves if Bias is still alive, or what the Lakers do to respond to his emergence. In short, there's no good way to judge the outcome of those 2 finals that never even happened. But let's talk about a big name we haven't even mentioned yet, Michael Jordan. As the Celtics phased out of the East, this gave Michael Jordan and the Bulls the chance to break through and battle the Pistons for the Eastern dominance. With the Celtics still present as the best team in the East, and Bias quite possibly emerging as a superstar, first, the Celtics and Bulls continuously meet in the playoffs, and Jordan gets a shot at Boston when he actually has a team to support him, unlike his earlier exits. This creates a Bulls-Celtics rivalry that really never existed, but it also creates a gigantic storyline between Bias and Jordan, as Jordan's legacy finally gets a challenge it never really had. Recall that this is something that was already budding when they were in college. Coach K called Bias and Jordan 2 of the best college basketball players he'd ever seen, and although Bias was drafted 2 years after Jordan, he was a bit more favorable in some people's eyes while they were still in college. Bias was taller, bigger, and stronger, and people overall just thought that Bias was more ready for the NBA than Jordan was. Obviously, we have no definite way to judge this, but the groundwork for the story is there, and that's what matters. With Bias being groomed to take over a dominant Celtics team at the same time that Jordan is bringing up the Bulls to one day be a dynasty, these 2 forces clash in epic battles that truly are missing from NBA history. Back to Bias' age though, we're going to say that around the age of 33 or 34 is when players typically begin to slow down in their careers. This means Bias is possibly dominant up to the year of 1998, the same year that Jordan wins his last championship in the original timeline. With Bias' presence, along with the dumb luck that he was drafted to an already dominant Boston team that now has an extended lifetime, it's safe to say that Bias and the Celtics prevent Jordan from at least some of his finals appearances. So now all of a sudden, we're discussing more of the Celtics in the 90s, and it's quite possible that the Bulls dynasty never becomes a thing even if they do win multiple championships, because it's inevitable that they're sharing the spotlight with the Celtics. Bird stayed in the NBA until '92 when he was practically forced out by his health, which probably doesn't happen with Bias taking more of a lead role. McHale didn't retire until 1993, and he aged in dog years after destroying his foot in 1987, which also wouldn't have happened with Bias present. And Parrish didn't leave Boston until '94 when he still put up a respectable 11 points and 7 rebounds, which is really all a loaded Boston squad would have needed from him. So 2 of Boston's big 3 went away prematurely due to the wear and tear effect they endured. Does it sound far-fetched that with Bias's benefits that the Celtics could have lasted until around 1994 where Bird would have been 37 years old? Remember in my older Bird video, I mentioned that he clearly still had a lot of skill left in the tank by retirement. His body had just betrayed him. Bird could have still been an extremely effective passer and shooter by age 37, and Boston, with a tweak here and there, would have very well still have been contenders. But to the second point, Jordan could have finally had his personal competition. Take a look throughout NBA history. Anytime there's a flat-out great player, there seems to be another great player that works as his counterbalance, the player he has to share the league with and fight against for dominance. Russell had Wilt, Bird had Magic, Kobe had LeBron, but then there's just this really awkward time in NBA history where you have Jordan and a random assortment of teams that he had to face. But that one guy that you'd mention every time Jordan's name is brought up, well, it's missing, because in all likelihood, that guy was Len Bias. This would have changed everything about NBA history. 6-0 has a less likely chance of happening, as Jordan probably doesn't reach 6 finals. 2 3-peats has a less likely chance of happening, and instead of Jordan being the biggest influencer in the sports culture throughout the 90s that made the game go global, now you're talking about both Jordan and Bias inspiring a generation. But the scope of Bias's death goes beyond what would have happened in the 90s. It potentially reaches into today's league in a big way you've likely never thought about. First off, I mentioned the butterfly effect earlier, which some of you may know as the concept where one event happening differently changes everything. This is huge in sports because even the smallest trade can influence another team to make a different decision, and ultimately everything ends up differently than we know it. In Len Bias's case, his potential superstardom not only extends the Celtics dynasty, but it makes it so that the Celtics aren't bad enough by 1998 to be in the lottery and select Paul Pierce. In 98, Bias would have been 34 years old, meaning he'd probably still be a star bearing any freak injuries. Let's assume Boston transitioned out of the Bird era just as smoothly as the Spurs transitioned out of the Duncan era. The Spurs were able to add LaMarcus Aldridge and pick up different role players along the way to surround Kawhi so that they're still a contending team every season. If Boston does the same with Bias, there's zero chance that they go 36 and 46 in the 1997 season, which means they don't end up with the 10th pick in the draft that selected Paul Pierce. Now again, because of the butterfly effect, we're not even going to try to reimagine the draft orders this many years back, but we don't really need to. Paul Pierce not being selected by Boston means he doesn't experience years of losing with this specific franchise. The conditions necessary to recreate the 2007 scenario that landed both Allen and Garnett next to Pierce are nearly impossible by this point, meaning the big three in Boston never happens. Why is that significant? You may recall my theory that Boston's 08 team was the most important super team in the modern day because they directly influence where we are now. The existence of the 08 Celtics created the need for LeBron James to leave Cleveland to beat them, and in doing so he created the Heat's big three, and he paved the way for players to take control of their own careers in free agency. This move, as Kevin Durant decided himself, was a big factor in his decision this summer when he decided to go to Golden State. So by this point, we've moved 21 years from Bias's death in our new timeline, and here it's impossible to say, but maybe the era of artificial big threes doesn't ever begin. Of course, we'll never know who else might have attempted what Boston did, but remember, that took a very specific set of circumstances to even happen in the first place. The Sonics looking to move Allen, Kevin Garnett waiving his no trade clause to go to Boston once Allen did appear there. Remember, he didn't even want to leave the Timberwolves to begin with. So if another situation doesn't come about where the conditions are absolutely right to join 3-star players who were still relatively in their prime, does the era that we're in now ever start? It didn't before 2007, right? Teams were trying to put together older guys at the end of their careers, but nobody had the right conditions to do exactly what Boston did for so long, so how does it happen if Boston doesn't do it? With all the circumstances that change with Bias being alive, the number of wins and losses another team inadvertently gets through Boston surviving the 90s, the different trades with players and draft picks that occurs because of Boston surviving the 90s, with everything that could have happened, do we even know for sure if Cleveland still ends up with LeBron in 2003? What if he ends up getting drafted by a team that isn't as desert dry as Cleveland? Remember who LeBron James is. If he's drafted by a team that has any sort of young talent on it, they're almost immediately contending, and then maybe he never leaves that city because he has adequate help for the first 7 years of his career. But now this entire thing has become completely convoluted, and we're in a zone where we can't even begin to guess the scenarios. But I did that just to show you how much Len Bias' death completely changed the entire course of history. Maybe more so than any other event in NBA history. And until we discover a way to peek into alternate universes to see what actually did happen in the event that he lived, this is all just speculation, but we do know for sure that Len Bias would have changed everything. So that's all I got for you guys today. I've been wanting to do a Len Bias video for the longest, and I finally got around to it. These what if scenario type videos are always very fun, so if you want to see more, make sure to hit the like button, comment, and subscribe. And also remember, if you do want a Len Bias shirt, the links to that are in the description and they are in the comment section. So thanks for watching, I'm Dom2K, and I'll see you guys on the next one.